The town calls him coward. The army left him for dead. And now, the train brings him something worse than a ghost, an Apache woman with eyes full of storms and a past tied to the one order he refused to carry out. What begins as a punishment will crack them both open beneath the unforgiving sun. The desert wind hit Clearwater like a curse. Red dust clawed at window panes, crept into mouths, and settled in the bones of every soul still stuck in that sun-split town. Caleb Flint stood at the edge of the train platform, hat low, face carved by time and silence. Folks kept their distance, not out of respect, out of disgust. "That's the coward from Fort Bowie," someone muttered behind cupped hands. "He let him go. Wouldn't pull the trigger," spat another. Caleb heard it all. Let them whisper. Words never drew blood like bullets. And he'd already bled enough for one lifetime. He brushed his fingers absently over the scar that cut across his ribs. A gift from his own men. Not from warriors. No. The real wound came when he defied a direct order to slaughter an Apache camp. Women, children, elders. He dropped his rifle. And for that, they shot him down and left him to rot in the canyon dust. The train screeched into the station with a shuddering scream, metal grinding metal. Caleb didn't flinch. Not until the doors parted and the devil kept his promise. She stepped off slow, barefoot, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Her skin bore the sun's burn, her face sharp with hunger and hard years. She didn't blink at the stares or the spitting. Just stood there. Quiet, proud, unmoved. Her name was written nowhere, but he'd learn it soon enough. Caleb stepped forward, not to greet her, but to take the battered sack from her hands. His voice came low and steady. "Let's go." She didn't move at first. Her eyes locked onto his, black as onyx, unreadable. Then, with a single nod, she turned with him. The crowd peeled back, their contempt a wall he knew too well. Only one man met his eyes, Zeke Callahan, the town blacksmith, old and thick-armed. He nodded once. That was enough. A slip of paper was shoved into Caleb's hand by the station master. "Special delivery," the man wheezed. "Came with her, from Fort Bowie." The handwriting on the note burned like acid. A gift for the coward who lost his nerve. She's the last of her clan. The very ones you spared. Let's see how much mercy you've got left, Flint. Signed, Major Gideon Croft. Caleb crushed the letter in his fist. His jaw worked, but no words came. He looked at her. This woman who'd been handed to him like some twisted test of character. Did she know what she was? What Croft had done? Did she even know who he was? Her face gave nothing away. They walked through the dust-drenched streets of Clearwater like ghosts. Mothers pulled their children close. Shopkeepers found sudden fascination in their own windows. No one spoke, no one helped. The world narrowed to the sound of boots in sand and the creak of the wagon's leather. Whisper Creek lay 2 hours east, if you didn't break a wheel. It wasn't much. A crooked cabin, a dying garden, a man trying to disappear. She sat beside him on the wagon bench, upright, eyes straight ahead, her silence louder than any cry. "How far?" she asked at last, her voice rough but clear. "Hour. Maybe less," Caleb said. "Place called Whisper Creek." "A creek with no water," she muttered. Something like a bitter laugh followed. He gave a tight nod. "Runs after rain, sometimes." She picked at the fraying edge of her blanket. Her hands were small, cracked, still strong. "Why you?" she asked, not looking at him. He didn't lie. "I served under the man who sent you. This is his punishment, for both of us." "Punishment," she repeated, like testing the shape of a stone in her mouth. "For what crime?" Caleb's grip tightened on the reins. Living. By sundown, the cabin came into view. A sad little thing slumped near a dry wash. The barn leaned west, fence half fallen, soil stubborn as sin. But it was his. He helped her down. Her weight surprised him, light as hunger. He pointed to the loft. You sleep up there. I'll take downstairs. She looked around, noting the single cot, the mismatched chairs, the rifle above the door, thick with dust. You don't mean to do what's expected? The question came blunt, but not fearful. Just tired. No, he said. She didn't move, just studied him, the war behind her eyes still burning. He stepped outside to tend the horse. The wind stung his face, but he welcomed the bite. It was real. It was present. Not like the ghosts clawing at his memories, Croft's voice barking orders, the screams at Battle Canyon, the sound of his own breath as blood filled his lungs. Inside, she sat by the cold hearth, chewing a strip of dried meat like it was her last meal. He handed her a cup of water. She took it without touching his fingers. What did the letter say? She asked. He stared at the fireplace. Nothing worth remembering. But she knew. Somehow she already knew. I was there, she whispered. Battle Canyon. I saw you. You dropped your rifle. Caleb turned, stunned. And I saw you fall. Outside, the coyotes howled. Inside, two people sat in the shadows of the same fire, both burned by the same war. But neither one of them knew, yet, that their story had only just begun. Call to action. End of part 1. If that twist struck your soul like desert thunder, don't ride off just yet. There's more coming down this dusty trail. Hit that subscribe button and saddle up for part 2, where silence turns to steel and scars start to speak. The road to Whisper Creek vanished behind them, swallowed by dust and the kind of silence that settled deep, like old bones. Inside the cabin, night stretched long and sharp. Coyotes cried from the ridgeline, their voices ragged with hunger or grief. It was hard to tell which. Caleb Flint lay on the cot below, while Nita sat cross-legged in the loft, her silhouette sharp against the flickering firelight. Neither slept. He'd known the day would come when the past would walk right into his house. He just hadn't expected it to arrive barefoot and staring him down with eyes full of old ruin. Her knowing, her seeing him at Battle Canyon, had shaken something loose in him that he didn't know was still held tight. When dawn cracked open the sky, he was already up, splitting kindling outside, bare arms streaked with sweat and wood dust. The desert air still held a bite, but heat was coming fast. It always did. Nita appeared in the doorway without a word. She moved like a shadow, light-footed and lean, wrapped in the same threadbare blanket, but her eyes were clear now, unflinching. He handed her a tin of water, and she took it, nodding once. The gesture between them was brittle, but it held. They went about the day without talking. She swept the packed earth floor. He repaired a broken hinge on the barn. The silence wasn't peace, but it was something sturdier than mistrust. That afternoon, Caleb found her crouched by the garden, fingers buried in the bone-dry soil. Her hands worked slow, deliberate, like she wasn't just digging, but remembering something. A way of life, a way back. You're wasting your time, he said from the porch. That dirt don't give nothing but dust and weeds. She didn't look up. Soil remembers, even when people forget. The words hit him harder than he let show. He tipped his hat and walked off, pretending not to feel seen. By evening, the sky turned the color of rust and blood. Caleb hauled water from the well, teeth clenched against the pump's stubborn moan. The damn thing had a trick to it. Twist, hold, pull, he muttered curses under his breath. Nita stepped beside him without a word and reached for the handle. It stuck. Again, he moved behind her. "Here," he said, voice low. He placed his hand over hers, guiding the twist. The pump gave a metallic groan, then a gush of cold water splashed over their hands. She gasped, startled. For a breath, their eyes locked. Water clung to her lashes. Her mouth parted, not for words, but for something raw. Recognition. Then she looked away, drying her hands on the edge of her skirt. He watched her walk back toward the cabin, her spine straight, proud even in retreat. That's when he realized he'd smiled, for the first time in God knew how long. Later, a knock of boots on the porch yanked him from the rhythm of repairing a bridle strap. A horse waited out front. The rider was broad-shouldered, blacksmith's soot still in the folds of his coat. Zeke Callahan. "Evenin', Flint," Zeke said, stepping down. His voice was low, rough as a whetstone. "Didn't come for horseshoes." Caleb didn't answer, just held the door open. Inside, Zeke gave Nita a long, unreadable look. She stood by the hearth, arms crossed, chin up like someone who'd survived more than men like Zeke could imagine. Zeke turned to Caleb. "Thought you should know. Deputy Brody's been sniffing around town. Croft sent word. Says he's riding in personal. Inspection tour." The words landed like a hammer to the chest. Caleb's jaw tightened. "That bastard still breathing?" Zeke nodded. "And coming straight for you." Nita didn't flinch. Her voice came clear and calm. "Then teach me." Caleb blinked. "Teach you?" "To shoot," she said, stepping forward. "To fight. If he comes again, I won't die hiding." Zeke gave a low whistle. "She's got iron in her, Flint." Caleb looked at her. Really looked. She wasn't just surviving. She was ready to stand. He nodded once. "We start tomorrow." That night, Nita sat near the fire, grinding corn with his old millstone. Caleb watched her fingers move in steady rhythm. It was the same rhythm his own hands used when cleaning a rifle. Precise, patient, practiced. She spoke without looking up. "I don't sleep easy?" "Neither do I," Caleb said. "But I reckon folks like us ain't meant to." He reached for a tattered book on the shelf, but didn't open it. "You ever shoot before?" She nodded. "My father taught my brothers. I watched. You learn fast?" "Quicker than most." Their eyes met again. This time something passed between them. No truce, no forgiveness. Just an understanding, forged in fire and grit. Outside, the wind rose again. The desert always knew when war was coming. They didn't talk much. But somehow things got said. At Whisper Creek, the days stacked like fence rails. Hot, dry, cracked through the middle, but holding together with something like purpose. Caleb worked the land with his usual silent grit. Nita moved through the cabin and garden with a quiet, coiled steadiness. Her hands always busy, her eyes always scanning. Something had shifted since the rain and the truth. They weren't strangers anymore. Not friends, not lovers, not yet. But something like a fragile truce had bloomed in the space between them. Dusty and unexpected as desert flowers after a hard storm. It showed itself in little things. Caleb found the pump already working most mornings, water splashing into the basin before the sun cleared the ridge. His shirt, mended without a word, hung on the porch one afternoon. He never asked. She never said. But her stitches were strong and straight, and he wore it like armor. She planted corn where the ground barely remembered what growth meant. The old garden, long given up for dead, now showed faint signs of life. A sprout here, a green shoot there. Nita coaxed things from the soil like she was part of it, resilient, deliberate, unyielding. One morning, she stood at the barn door, rifle in hand. Caleb had shown her the day before how to hold it, how to feel the weight of it, not just in her arms but in her conscience. Now she stood with her back straight and her feet set. "Ready?" he asked, tipping his hat back. Nita didn't smile, but there was a glint in her eye. "Don't go easy on me." He handed her a bullet. Never planned to. She fired. Missed wide. Second shot, closer. Third, dead center of the bottle balanced on the fence post. Caleb blinked. Well, hell. She didn't gloat. Just set the butt down in the dirt, reloaded, and lined up again. He crossed his arms, watching her. "Your brothers taught you?" She nodded. "Before the soldiers came." Caleb said nothing. He didn't need to. Some things didn't need revisiting to be understood. That evening, the heat broke just enough for supper to feel less like punishment. Caleb stirred beans over the fire, while Nita sat on the porch, carving something into a piece of driftwood with his old whittling knife. "You always this quiet?" he asked, settling beside her. She shrugged. "Quiet keeps you alive?" He nodded. "So does listening." She glanced at him. "You're not as soft as folks say." He chuckled, dry as dust. "You're not the first to tell me that." She set down the wood. Something small, maybe a bird, maybe just a shape not yet finished. "That man, Croft," she said, not looking at him. "He meant to break you. But you didn't break." Caleb looked out toward the horizon, where the sun had melted into the dirt. "You don't get to call it strength when all it did was get folks killed." "You said no," she replied, "when no one else did. That counts." He met her eyes then, and for a second, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was safe. The next day, trouble came with a badge. Deputy Wes Brody rode up like he owned the world, boots propped high in the stirrups, mouth twisted into a smirk. He didn't dismount. Just stayed high in the saddle, looking down his nose at the homestead like it was something stuck to his boot. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Still got her here, Flint?" Caleb stepped onto the porch, wiped his hands on his shirt. "She's under my roof. That's all you need to know." Brody leaned forward. "Folks in town don't like it. A red girl living free makes folks nervous." Caleb didn't flinch. "Ain't asking permission." "She yours?" Brody sneered. "No," Caleb said, voice like gravel. "But she is under my word. You want to push it, you come through me?" A beat passed. Brody's eyes narrowed. Then he spat into the dirt and pulled his reins. "You'll regret that." As the dust kicked up behind him, Nita stepped out from the shadows. She hadn't said a word during the whole exchange, but she'd heard it all. She looked at Caleb. Something like respect etched into her face. That night he found a bundle of dried sage on his cot. "For strength," she said simply. The days went on. The quiet between them no longer brittle, just present. Caleb showed her how to repair the old millstone. She taught him words in her language. Bidzil, strength, tu, water, shah, sun. In the evenings, she sometimes hummed as she worked. Low, haunting melodies with no words, just memory. And for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Flint looked around Whisper Creek and thought, maybe peace doesn't come all at once. Maybe it's built, one quiet act at a time. Nita had taken to the books like a storm takes to a dry arroyo. Quiet at first, then all-consuming. Each morning before the heat set in, she would slip into the corner of the cabin where Caleb kept his dog-eared collection of manuals, newspapers, and a war-stained logbook. She'd trace each letter with her finger, lips moving as she sounded them out under her breath. It was slow going, but it mattered. Every word wrestled from the page felt like reclaiming something they'd tried to strip from her. Caleb watched without interfering. He figured there were two kinds of silence: the kind that hides pain, and the kind that builds strength. Nita's was the latter. But strength has a way of finding the wrong things, too. That afternoon, Caleb had ridden out to mend a busted post at the south fence line. Dust hung heavy in the air, windless and watching. When he came back, his boots crunched through the yard in that familiar rhythm. He knew something was wrong before the door even creaked open. Nita stood near the table. Her back was straight, her hands clenched around a sheet of yellowed paper, creased, sweat-stained, and inked in a handwriting Caleb hadn't seen in weeks. Croft's letter, his jaw locked tight as a branding clamp. "What are you doing?" he asked, low. She didn't flinch. Her voice was brittle. "It has my name in it, doesn't it?" Caleb stepped inside, closing the door behind him like it might muffle what came next. "That letter's poison." Her eyes didn't move from the page. "It says you were sent me, as a gift." The air between them collapsed. She read, each word punching through the quiet. "A gift for the coward, to test if you had any mercy left." Caleb's stomach twisted. She looked up, her voice hoarse. "So that's what I am?" "No," he said quickly. "That's what he meant you to be." "I never." She stepped back. "You knew all this time." "I didn't know how to tell you." Her face changed, like something inside her cracked but didn't break. "Not yet. So I was never a choice. I was just punishment." "No," he said again, softer this time, stepping toward her. "I never saw you that way." "Then why didn't you burn this?" she demanded, shaking the letter. "Why keep it? Why let it sit there in your drawer like some reminder of what I'm meant to be?" He had no good answer, only the ache in his chest and the weight of 5 years' worth of regret pressing down like a mountain. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "But I didn't because I thought I could outrun it. Thought if I kept my head down and did right by you, the past would stay buried." She dropped the letter to the floor like it burned her. Her voice shook. "You can't bury the dead if you keep dragging their bones around." Then she turned, pushed through the door, and vanished into the rising dusk. The storm hit fast. By the time Caleb saddled the mare, the horizon was already smeared red and gray. Grit clawed at his face, filled his mouth. He rode blind, boots pounding dirt, yelling her name into a wind that wasn't listening. He found her just before the canyon ridge, crouched near the dry creek, arms wrapped tight around her knees, the letter crumpled in her fist like a last piece of truth. "Nita," he said, breathless, "you'll freeze out here." She didn't look at him. "Why do you care?" His throat tightened. "Because I see you." She turned, face streaked with dust, eyes dark and hurt. "You saw me when you needed forgiveness, not before." "I didn't pity you," he said. "I never did." "Then why keep me?" He knelt, voice raw. "Because I couldn't let them break you like they tried to break me. Because if I gave you back, it'd be like finishing what Croft started. And I couldn't live with that." Her voice cracked. "You think I need saving?" "No," he whispered. "I think I need forgiving." The storm wailed through the rocks like some ancient animal, clawing at them both. She looked down at the letter in her hand. Slowly she opened her fingers. The wind took it. The paper fluttered once, then vanished, ripped from them like a curse finally lifted. Nita looked up at him, and her voice was quieter, steadier. Forgiveness isn't mine to give. I know, he said, but truth is all I got left. She stared at him, long and silent. Then, without warning, she reached up, touched the side of his face with her dirt-streaked hand. We're both broken things, she said. Maybe broken things don't need fixing. Just someone to walk with. He held her hand to his cheek, eyes shut, jaw clenched. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. By sunrise, they were riding back to Whisper Creek. Two silhouettes against a pale orange sky, both carrying less weight than they'd left with. The garden would still struggle. The fences would still break. Croft was still coming. But something had shifted. A scar, maybe. But one they shared now. And scars, Caleb Flint had learned, meant a wound had survived. The days after the storm were quieter. Not soft. Nothing out here ever was. But still, like the land itself had taken a breath. Whisper Creek carried on. Caleb and Nita worked in rhythm now. No more hesitation. No more circling like two wolves unsure of the other's bite. He taught her to reload with speed. She taught him how to bind wounds with herbs that smelled of juniper and fireweed. Each night, when the desert cooled and the wind brushed through the mesquite like a warning, they'd sit beneath the stars in silence. Not alone anymore, but not safe either. Because they both knew peace out here was a borrowed thing, and Croft had never been one to leave a debt unpaid. It was Deputy Brody who brought the bad news, face full of self-importance as he rode up like a man delivering prophecy. His horse kicked dust over Nita's fresh-planted squash, and he didn't bother to apologize. Flint, Brody said, not even nodding toward Nita. Figured you ought to know. Major Gideon Croft's due in town by end of week. Caleb stood on the porch, jaw set tight. Croft don't ride for nothing less than blood. Well, Brody said with a lazy grin. Maybe he's just taken in the sights, or maybe... He turned toward Nita, eyes narrowing. He's coming to clean up the last piece of his unfinished business. Caleb stepped down, slow and sure. You tell Croft this ain't the army. He steps on my land again. I won't be lowering my rifle this time. Brody tipped his hat mockingly. Then you best get to polishing it, Flint. Just doing my duty letting you know. He rode off whistling, his shadow stretching long in the late light. That night, Nita didn't speak. She just laid her knife across the table, alongside a stack of loaded shells. Caleb took one look and understood. He went to the trunk by the bed and pulled out the old Colt. Cleaned. Oiled. Loaded. When she looked at him, he just said, "Sometimes a promise has to bend, so something else don't break." Nita's voice was even. Then teach me more. For the next 3 days, the cabin became a fortress in training. Nita learned to fire under pressure, standing, kneeling, from cover. She practiced stripping and cleaning the rifle until her hands moved without thought. She was focused, unshakable, disciplined. The kind of student born from necessity and sharpened by memory. Where'd you learn to steady like that? Caleb asked, watching her nail a tin can from 30 yards. She didn't stop reloading. My father taught my brothers. I watched. Then I lost them. Now I watch no more. Caleb nodded. Then we stand together, when Croft comes. But it wasn't Croft who arrived first. Just past sundown, hoofbeats echoed off the rocks, fast and desperate. Caleb stepped out, rifle at the ready, until he saw the familiar hunched silhouette of a man riding hard and sloppy. It was Zeke Callahan, the blacksmith, sweat soaked through his shirt, eyes wild. He barely managed to dismount before speaking. He's here. Croft. Got in this morning. Quiet like a snake in boots. Caleb's stomach dropped. Already? Zeke nodded. Didn't come alone. 2 men in uniform with him. Real mean-looking types. But that ain't all. He handed Caleb a crumpled scrap of paper, creased and damp with sweat. Croft's handwriting. Inspection tour. Property complaint, unauthorized harboring of hostile native. Subject, Nita. Arrest recommended. Warrant pending. Nita stepped out from behind the door. Then it begins, she said, voice steady. Zeke turned to her. Heard what he did to my son, Jesse. Sent him into a canyon ambush without backup. Said it was discipline. My boy didn't come back. Croft's not just coming for you. Caleb looked at him. Why are you telling me this now? Zeke's jaw clenched. Because I got nothing left to lose. Caleb nodded once. Then stay and help. Zeke looked toward Nita, who was already tying back her hair, loading rounds into the belt across her chest. I'll stand with you, he said. That night, the 3 of them sat at the table. Old soldier, forgotten woman, grieving father. They didn't talk about strategy, or escape, or mercy. Only one thing mattered now. The line had been drawn. The past was coming. And when it crossed the threshold of Whisper Creek, it wouldn't find victims waiting. It would find something sharper, something forged from shame, loss, and the will to never let history write the end again. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridgeline when dust kicked up on the trail to Whisper Creek. Caleb stood at the fence line, eyes narrowed, thumb brushing along the stock of his rifle. Inside the cabin, Nita checked the door bolts again, a knife tucked at her belt, another at her ankle. Her hands didn't tremble. They hadn't trembled since Croft's name returned to the wind. The rider came fast. Not like a soldier. Not organized. Urgent. Zeke stepped out from behind the barn, shotgun resting loose in his thick hands. Ain't Croft, he muttered. Caleb spotted the rider's slouch, the sway in the saddle. That's Silas Quinn, pastor's boy. Sure enough, the young man reined in hard, dust choking his words. He's coming, Silas gasped. Croft, not alone, 6 soldiers. He's got papers. Says she's a thief. Nita stepped out from the porch. Thief? Her voice was calm, like cold water poured over hot coals. Silas nodded. Town's courthouse clerk told me. He forged a warrant. Says you stole military property from Fort Bowie. Rations and field gear. That lie'll hold just long enough to pull a trigger, Caleb said, jaw locked. He's coming to take her, Caleb, Silas added. Not ask, not argue. How long? Maybe an hour. They left before sunup. Zeke looked toward the cabin. Then we hold. Caleb turned to Silas. Ride back. Tell Martha Hayes, Amos Fitch, anyone with a spine still left in Clearwater. Croft ain't coming for justice. He's coming to finish the job the Army started. They've got a choice. Turn away again, or stand. Silas gave a sharp nod and took off down the trail like the devil was biting at his heels. By the time the soldiers rode into view, the land was quiet, as a breath held too long. Croft came first, proud, polished, and smug. His boots gleamed, his coat pressed. Behind him, 6 blue-uniformed soldiers fanned out like a pack of dogs. Nita stood in the cabin doorway, head high, rifle at her side. Croft dismounted slow, like he wanted the moment to last. Well, well, he drawled, eyes sweeping the yard. Didn't expect a welcome committee, Flint. You ain't welcome, Caleb replied, stepping forward. Turn back. Croft smiled without warmth. I've got a lawful warrant. She's wanted for theft of federal property. You stand in the way, that makes you complicit. Caleb raised the rifle just enough to make a promise. You want her, you'll walk through fire. Croft's smirk faltered just slightly. You really want to die over this? Behind him, The soldiers shifted. Hands to holsters, eyes scanning. Then a voice cut across the tension. "Funny thing about fire, Major. It draws company." Croft turned. Across the ridge came dust. Not military dust, town dust, Clearwater dust. Zeke grinned. "Looks like company showed." First came Martha Hayes, long skirt flapping, shotgun resting like she was born with it. Amos Fitch next, face like a plow blade, carrying an old hunting rifle. Silas was back too, riding hard. And more. 10, maybe 12 folks in all, spread across the trail behind Croft. Not soldiers, just neighbors, farmers, merchants, folks who'd buried sons and daughters and brothers for lies told in polished offices. "This ain't military business," Zeke said, stepping to Caleb's side. "This is personal. We remember Battle Canyon." Croft's lips curled. "You people have no authority here." Martha cocked her shotgun. "Neither do you." Silence fell. One of the younger soldiers, barely 20, shifted his weight. His eyes met Nita's for a split second, and then dropped. Shame or understanding. Maybe both. Croft turned to his men. "Arrest them all!" No one moved. "I gave you an order." Still, nothing. Then the youngest soldier backed up, slowly, then faster. One by one they followed, until only Croft remained, red-faced, teeth clenched. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed. "No," Caleb said, "but it makes today the day you lose." Croft glared at them all, then turned, mounted, and rode off into the heat. That night, the air at Whisper Creek was cool again. The stars came out early. The fire cracked low. Caleb leaned against the porch rail, rifle at rest. Nita stepped beside him. "He'll come back." "I know. But so will we." He looked at her, worn, weathered, unbroken. "You sure you want this fight?" She nodded. "I've lived in the shadow of it too long. If the fire's comin', I'd rather stand in it than run." He watched the night for a long time after. Croft was wounded now, and a wounded predator don't limp away. It circles back, and when it did, they'd be ready. The next morning, the sky hung low like a threat. Gray clouds sprawled over the valley, holding back a rain that wouldn't come. Caleb Flint watched the horizon from the edge of the field, jaw locked, rifle leaning against his leg. He wasn't waiting. He was expecting. Behind him, Whisper Creek breathed quiet. Chickens scratched in dust. The forge had gone cold for now. Zeke said no man could work iron with gunfire hanging in the air like thunder. Nita had disappeared out back after sunrise. She did that lately, when silence pressed too heavy. But this time, she returned with something in her hand. A strip of painted cloth. Torn, weathered. Caleb turned. "What's that?" She hesitated. "It belonged to my brother, JC." He studied her face. She hadn't spoken his name in weeks. "Found it near the South Trail," she added. "Half buried. You think Croft?" "No, not his kind of trail." Her voice was low but sharp. "Apache sign. Faint but recent. They passed near here. Not scouts, family." Caleb nodded. "Could be he's alive. Or someone who knew him. Either way, it means something." But whatever quiet hope flickered in her voice got cut off by a thundering hoot from the ridge. Zeke came loping down on horseback, face hard as boot leather. "We got trouble," he called. Croft's posted bounty flyers in Clearwater. Caleb cursed under his breath. "Dead or alive?" he asked. Zeke grimaced. "Alive, for now. But the way it's worded, dangerous deserter, accomplice to theft, traitor to the Union. It's a death sentence with pretty paper on top." "Amount?" $200. Even Nita blinked. That was enough to tempt starving men, drunk men, and desperate men with no compass left. Caleb took the flyer from Zeke. The sketch on it was crude, but recognizable. "She can't stay here," Zeke said. "This ranch is going to draw every bounty hunter between here and El Paso." "I'm not running," Nita said flat. "Didn't say you had to," Caleb replied, folding the paper slow. "But we need to move. Lay smoke. Head east. Follow the waterline. Maybe double back to Sierra Draw." Zeke rubbed his beard. "I know a man out past Red Mesa, old tracker. Used to run scouts for the army till they turned on him. Apache, too." "What's his name?" Nita asked. "Goes by Sonny. Keeps to himself. But if anyone can find your brother's trail—" Nita nodded once. They packed light: water, dried venison, ammo, a spare horse. Caleb saddled the Grula mare, quiet and sure-footed. He strapped his Winchester across his back, then handed a sawed-off to Nita. She raised a brow. "You think I'll need it?" "I think I'll be angry if you don't." They rode out before dusk. Caleb led, Nita close behind, Zeke watching the rear like a bloodhound on two legs. By midnight, they'd crossed the riverbed and made it into the canyon flats. The stars were sharp above them. Coyotes called, but far off. At camp, they didn't speak much. Caleb sat beside the fire, whittling without purpose, eyes on the dark. Nita cleaned the sawed-off methodically, like it was a prayer. "You still think it was a mistake?" she asked, not looking up. He glanced over. "What?" "Saving me." Caleb paused, then shook his head. "It wasn't saving. It was seeing. I saw you. That's what men like Croft don't do. That's why they lose." She smiled faintly, but it didn't last. "You think Sonny will help?" "If he believes in something stronger than a bounty," Caleb said. "And if he doesn't?" Caleb turned to her, eyes steady. "Then I will." By morning, they reached a ridge overlooking a burnt-out homestead. Charred posts, blackened stone. Nita's face went still. "Apache fire?" "No," she whispered. "Army." Zeke circled the remains. "This was recent." "Too recent," Caleb muttered. Then a shot rang out. Dirt exploded near Caleb's boot. Another cracked past Zeke's shoulder. "Get down!" They dove for cover behind a half-fallen wall. "Sniper," Nita growled. "North side." "Croft's men?" Caleb asked. "No," she said, loading the sawed-off. "This is freelance." Another shot. Nita crawled to the edge and waited. Then, when the muzzle flash lit from the ridge, she stood and fired. One blast. A yelp. Silence. Then, coughing and stumbling, a man tumbled down the slope, clutching his side. A greasy coat, missing teeth. The kind of man who'd kill for coin, then blame the world for his luck. Zeke dragged him close. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood. "Nobody. Saw the poster. $200 buys a lot of whiskey." "Not today," Caleb said. The man grinned, teeth red. "They'll keep coming. That girl's worth gold now." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "No," he said. "She's worth war." The wind in Red Mesa didn't whisper. It scraped, sharp, dry, biting. The kind of wind that carried stories, if you listened hard enough. Caleb and Nita had ridden into it with Zeke trailing behind, but none of them spoke much. Not after the ambush. Not after burying the man who came for her blood like it was just another day's work. They rode in silence for another half-day until Zeke raised a hand. "There," he muttered. "By the dead juniper. See the smoke?" Nita narrowed her eyes. A thin line rose into the morning sky, pale against the cliffs. "That's him?" Caleb asked. Zeke nodded. "Sonny. They say he speaks more with the dead than the living. If anyone knows the ways your people used to travel, it's him." Nita said nothing, but her grip tightened on the reins. Sani lived in a stone dugout tucked against a ledge. No door, just a thick hide hung over the opening, marked with faded ochre symbols. Bones lined the path. Coyote, deer, maybe worse. Some strung like wind chimes, others buried halfway, their teeth grinning at the sun. He was already outside when they dismounted. Barefoot. Skin like old leather. Eyes cloudy but not blind, just far-seeing. "I smelled your sorrow yesterday," he said to Nita, voice low and gravelly. It traveled fast. Zeke tipped his hat. "She's looking for her brother." "I know." "You know?" Caleb asked. Sani's gaze drifted toward him. "The boy JC passed through here 2 moons ago, hungry, limping, fear in his chest, but he carried a name like fire." Nita's lips parted, breath caught. "He's alive?" "Was. Still breathing when he left. Headed northeast, toward Devil's Pass." Zeke frowned. "That land's cursed." Sani chuckled. "Only if you go in with sins unburied." Caleb stepped forward. "Can you track him?" "I could," Sani said slowly, "but I will not." Nita's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because I only walk with the willing, and you," he turned to her, "carry more than grief. You carry vengeance. That clouds the path." She met his stare, unflinching. "What would you do if they took your brother? Branded your name like rot on every wall?" Sani stepped closer, until their faces nearly touched. "I would burn quietly," he said, "until the wind carried only ash." A beat passed. Then he turned. "But you are not me, and I see now. You would carry your brother through fire if it meant one breath more." He walked back to the hide-draped doorway. "Then follow." They spent the night in silence again, under the red rock cliffs. Sani did not cook. He lit no fire, but he drew maps in the dust with a stick, marking dry wells, old paths, places where the wind lies. "That's where you'll find him," he said, pointing to a place called Crow's Bend. Nita traced the line. "You're not coming?" "My part ends here." Zeke huffed. "Figures." But Nita turned and bowed her head, not out of submission, but gratitude. "You gave me more than a trail. You gave me belief." Sani didn't answer, only tapped the earth once with his stick. Not all spirits wear faces. The next morning they rode out again. The terrain grew crueler. Sharp rocks, no water, buzzards circling overhead. At mid-morning, Caleb reined in hard. Smoke, small, faint, coming from behind a ridge near Crow's Bend. Zeke unslung his rifle. "Could be him." "Or bait," Caleb muttered. Nita drew her sawed off. "We'll go around. Come up behind the hill." They dismounted, crept low. As they rose to the ridge, Nita froze. Below was a boy, maybe 12. Skin sun-scorched, hair wild. One leg twisted wrong. He sat by the fire, talking to himself. "JC." Her breath hitched, but before she moved, Caleb caught her arm. "Wait." 3 other figures emerged from the rocks. Not soldiers, not Apaches. Mercenaries, hired knives. One of them pulled a map. Sani's map. They were using JC as bait. Nita's hands trembled. "Now what?" Zeke whispered. She looked down at her brother. "He's not alone anymore," she said. Nita didn't flinch as the wind whipped grit across her cheeks. Down in that dusty hollow, her brother sat barely upright, eyes glassy, unaware he was being used like a worm on a hook. Caleb, crouched beside her, clenched his jaw. Zeke's rifle was already shouldered, but his hands didn't shake. "3 of them," he whispered. "Maybe 4. Looks like bounty types. That tattoo on the tall one? He's ex-dragoon. That makes him mean and greedy." Nita's breath came shallow. "They used Sani's map." Or they followed us, Caleb muttered. Either way, it didn't matter. The trap had been sprung, and they were walking into it with eyes wide open. She scanned the rocks behind the mercenaries. Tight terrain, but passable. Her voice was calm, steady as a morning prayer. I'll go down. Draw their eyes. Zeke, from the bluff. Caleb, you flank left. Cut the tall one if he moves for JC. You'll get killed walking in like that, Zeke hissed. She looked at him, eyes dark as canyon shadow. He's my brother, and I won't let him die in front of me. Zeke grunted, but Caleb caught her arm before she stood. You sure you're not chasing ghosts, Nita? He asked. No, she whispered, just bringing one home. She walked slow, hands visible, the way women had to when too many guns were close. Her boots crunched gravel. The fire crackled louder as she approached, but the mercs noticed her before she cleared 20 paces. Well now, the tall one drawled, stepping forward. Looks like the little savage found her way back. Nita didn't blink. He's just a boy. He's no use to you. Boys got value. Folks pay good coin for Apache kin, especially if they squeal. She stepped closer. Take me instead. The men laughed. Sweetheart, another sneered. That was always the plan. Then all hell cracked loose. A shot rang from above, Zeke's rifle splitting the air. The dragoon dropped like a sack of wheat, neck a red ruin. Caleb moved fast, a blur of leather and dust, slamming into the second man before he could fire. Steel flashed. Then silence. The third man grabbed JC. Back off or I gut him. But JC, brave fool, bit his arm. The merc flinched, and that was all Nita needed. Her blade sang through the air, slicing clean into the man's thigh. He screamed, staggered, dropped the boy. JC scrambled behind her as Caleb finished the last one. Just like that. It was over. Nita dropped to her knees, holding JC's face in both hands. He was thinner, bones sharp beneath skin, but he was alive. Tears blurred her sight, and the boy blinked up at her, voice raspy. You came. She laughed through the ache. I never stopped. Zeke crouched nearby, checking bodies. Damn vultures, all of them carrying Gant's seal. Caleb's face darkened. Silas Gant sent bounty hunters after a child? Zeke held up a folded parchment. Looks like he put a price on both their heads. Nita stood, eyes burning. He wants to erase us. No, Caleb said, voice hoarse. He wants to bury what he did. Zeke looked at him. You gonna tell her? Nita froze. Tell me what? Caleb didn't speak right away. He knelt and stirred the fire with the toe of his boot, letting the ash rise before facing her. Years ago, before the raid, I rode with Gant's men. Didn't know what we were doing till it was too late. Your father's village, Eli Hale. He tried to stop them. I let it happen. I didn't pull the trigger, but I didn't stop it either. Silence fell like a storm. Nita's stare cut him deeper than any blade. You knew. I came to find you. To fix it. Not for redemption. There ain't any for me. Just a chance to do something right. She didn't speak. Just turned away, her breath shaking. JC looked between them, confused. Then she said quietly, I trusted you. I know. Zeke stepped between them. We can settle this later, but we need to ride. Gant won't stop. He's sending more. Nita finally turned. Then we end it. They buried the bodies shallow. No prayers, no stones. At sundown, 3 riders moved west. One carried the weight of a boy's life. One carried the weight of truth, and one carried fire. The sun hadn't yet touched the canyon rim when they reached Red Mesa. Below, Like a scar in the land, Silas Gant's estate sprawled out. Red roof, wide corral, 2 hired guns on the porch drinking coffee as if the world owed them peace. But the world didn't owe men like that anything, not after what they'd taken. Nita sat atop her mare, wind teasing strands of her braided hair, face shadowed with resolve. JC slept slumped against her back, small arms clutching her waist. He didn't stir when the horse snorted. Zeke rode behind, rifle laid across his lap. Caleb, quiet, battered, guilty, held the lead. He'd barely spoken since the confession. A part of him hoped she'd cut him loose. But she hadn't. Not yet. They dismounted behind a dry ravine, tying the horses where the brush thickened. Nita tucked her brother beneath a ledge, placed her hand over his heart. "I'll come back," she whispered. "You keep this fire burning." Zeke checked his rounds, steady as ever. Caleb stood apart, spine taut. He reached into his coat, pulled free a small leather pouch, and held it out to her. "Your father's. I kept it. After." She took it without a word, fingers tracing the beadwork like a memory. Her face didn't soften. Then she turned and started walking. They crossed the dirt yard just after the rooster crowed. One of the guards spotted them and reached for his belt, but Zeke dropped him with a shot clean through the chest. The second man staggered, firing blind, but Nita moved like smoke. 2 steps, knife out, slash through the wrist, and he dropped screaming. The house door swung open. Silas Gant stood in the threshold, silver hair combed back, boots polished, expression calm as a coiled rattler. Behind him, a dozen men stirred from breakfast. "Well," he said, "the dead walk." Zeke raised his rifle. "Call him off, Silas." But Gant's eyes were on Nita. "You're Hale's girl. I remember your mother. Wild eyes, fire in her voice. I see you carry it too." "You burned my father's name," she said. "Now I've come to burn yours." Gant chuckled. "You think I built all this by kneeling to ghosts?" Then Caleb stepped forward. "No," he said. "But you buried too many bodies under it." Gant's eyes narrowed. "You." "I stood by once. I won't again. And then the guns came out. It was short, ugly, and fast." Zeke took a round to the side, dropped one man before he hit the ground. Caleb shoved Nita down behind a water trough, caught a bullet through his thigh, but still managed to knife a gunman clean in the gut. Nita moved through the chaos like something unshakable, silent, fierce, swift. She reached Gant as he tried to retreat through the barn. He swung a pistol toward her, but she was already there. She knocked it aside. "Your kind always thinks we'll kneel," she said. He spat at her feet. "You're nothing. You'll always be nothing." She answered with steel, and Gant fell, not with a roar, but a whisper, his blood soaking into the earth he thought he owned. By dusk, the ranch was quiet. Zeke leaned against a post, wrapped in bandages, eyes closed but breathing steady. Caleb sat nearby, leg bound, face pale but grateful to still be upright. Nita stood alone on the porch, looking out across the land. The wind had shifted. Rain would come soon. Behind her, JC woke from sleep and climbed the steps, clutching the pouch of their father's that she'd left beside him. He placed it in her hands again. "It's yours now," he said. She smiled faintly, crouching down. "No," she said. "It's ours." They burned the ledgers, freed the stock hands, opened the food stores to nearby camps. Nobody stopped them. Some nodded in approval. Some simply watched. As night fell, Caleb limped beside her, unsure if he was welcome. "You gonna kill me for what I didn't stop?" She looked at him, eyes dark but not cruel. "No," she said. But you'll carry it." He nodded. "I already do." She looked out toward the stars. "But maybe now, you'll carry something else too." He met her gaze. "Like what?" "Hope," she said, "if you can earn it." By dawn, they were gone. Just 3 riders and a child, heading east, no banners, no songs. But the land remembered. The land always remembers. Final words to the audience. They came for justice. What they found was something harder. Truth, forgiveness, and the choice to rebuild from ruin. So now I ask you folks, what would you carry if it had been your past written in blood? And would you bury it or let it bloom?